For today's lesson, we are going to go over what's called relations. This is something you may have covered in your previous math classes, maybe not as much in depth. Um, and since you've covered it in the past, some of what we do today will be a little bit of review. We'll just kind of build that into the lesson as we go, but we will also go a little bit more in depth. So let us begin. I'm going to share my screen with you all so you all may follow along with the notes. The notes are going to be um, in the Unit 3 folder. Go ahead and click on it and follow along with me. All right, so here we are. 3-1 notes. That's what we are doing today. Let us begin. Our first blank, we're going to say a relation, and I'm going to type in green just to set it out from everything else. A relation is a set of ordered pairs. If you remember, ordered pairs look like this: parentheses x comma y. All right, that's what an ordered pair is. Okay, the first set of all the set of all first coordinates in an ordered pair, the x's, which are these bits right here. And I'm actually gonna underline that in a different color. All of the x's, all of these x's, these are called the domain. So far we have x is domain, okay? The domain of the relation. The set of all the second coordinates, the y's, are called the range. So we've got domain is x and range is y. Now these two things may sound familiar because you have done them before, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth with it as we go. So far we have domain is x and range is y. Let's use purple for range. All right, domain is x, range is y. And I'm going to be writing those down on the different examples that we do so we don't lose track of anything. So now that we know what the domain and the range are, we have definitions for those. Let's go through and let's start labeling some. Let's list some. So let's look at what this R says right here. This R equals. It gives us a list. This list has these curly brackets in it. These curly brackets are called braces. Now let's just go through and label. This is our Y, our second coordinate here, Y, Y. And forgive me for this writing. I'm still using my mouse. All right, those are Y's and these are X's. I did Y first because I had that color highlighted. X, 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 and X. There we go. We have our X's and our Y's. Now, when we go to list our domains and our ranges, we're going to use what's called braces, those curly brackets that I just mentioned. You hit the shift key and then you hit that square bracket button, that button there, and it'll give you the curly braces. When we list our domain, we list all of the X values in here. So we have and we're going to list them in order from least to greatest. So we have -5, comma, -2, comma, 0. And then we're going to close it. So you might be wondering, hey, Mr. Williams, in that R thing, we've got another 0 in there. Even though we have more than one 0, we only list the values once. We don't list repeating values, okay? We're going to list them only once. So when we do the range, I'm going to start with that curly bracket again, or with the brace again. And then I have a 1 as my smallest value. So I'm going to write 1, comma. Then I have an 8, and then a 9. And once again, I'm not going to list both 9s because we only write 1. We only write the value once. We don't write it multiple times. So this right here in this brace, this is an example of a list. We have listed them here. Our domain, which is our X values, and our range, which is our Y values. All right. Now, another way of listing these is to use what's called a mapping diagram. A mapping diagram. And a mapping diagram sounds a lot more complicated than it is. A mapping diagram is just this bit right here. I'm going to put a big old green circle around it. this or box around it. This is a mapping diagram. All right. This mapping diagram tells us our domain and our range, our X and our Y. And now that we have a mapping diagram, we're going to go ahead and learn a couple of other ways to identify our domain and our range. The elements of the domain for the X, let me go ahead and write that in, our X are called inputs. Those are X values. And the elements of the range, which are our Y values, the elements of the range are called outputs. All right. So now we have domain, which is X, and our inputs. And then we have our range, which is Y, and our outputs. And this is for a mapping diagram. A mapping diagram, you can tell it's a mapping diagram because it has arrows. It's telling us to go from our input and where to go. That's where the arrow tells us where to go, and then how to get to our output. And then a relation can also be represented by a table, which is over here to the right, or by an equation. And the formatting got a little messed up, but the space for that is down here. By an equation. This table gives us our inputs, our x's listed here, and our outputs, our y's listed here. And then for an equation, we can plug in an x, any x, and then that's our input. And then when we solve it, we will get a value for our y. That's going to be our output. Okay, so this is an equation, a mapping diagram, a table, and then we also have a list. Now, once again, we have domain, X, and input. Then we have range, Y, and output, right? So let's move on to this next portion and do a little bit of practice with actually mapping these things, okay? So here we have a graph. And before you even get started doing anything with this graph, let's go ahead and we have our Y here in case you can't see it. I'm going to put it bright in purple. And then our X here. Now this also seems to be a little bit misformatted. I'm going to draw these two circles over here so we can work with them later. These are going to be our diagram mappings. But first, let's start with what we have. In case you don't remember, going up on the graph, that's going to be positive. Going to the right on the graph is going to be positive. And the positive y direction is up, and the positive x direction to the right, and the negative y direction is down. That's where we get that minus sign. And then in the negative x direction is to the left, okay? That's just a quick little review for how we plot these things in a graph. So it's asking us to list our ordered pairs. Once again, a list is going to be this curly brace. You know, I'm just going to type it. I'm not going to draw it out. A list tells us to do this. Okay. The ordered pairs. Our ordered pairs are going to be X and Y. They're going to look like X and Y. X, comma, Y. And I'm not going to go through and write all those out because that would take very, very long. And oh yeah, yes, I will. So when we look at these, first let's plot them on the graph. If you think back to how we plot, we always go left or right first and then up and down. We have to walk to the elevator, whichever direction it is, before we can get on it to go up or down. Okay, that's how we're going to do this. And so let's plot this first point. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the left. So that's going to be a -5 for my X. And then a 1, 2, 3, up for my y. And I'm going to put the whole thing in parentheses because our ordered pairs go in parentheses. And now if we plot this one here, we don't go anywhere for our x. We stay right here in this at the y-axis. So that's going to be a 0 for our x. And then it's in the same line as that other one. So that's going to be a 3. 0, 3. And then here, we're going to go over to the right twice. 1, 2. That's going to be 2, 3. You know, let me adjust this because that doesn't look like a comma. That looks like a negative sign. 0, -3. Don't forget our parentheses. And then this next one is going to be a 2. And I'm just going to type it out because this is taking me quite a while. This is going to be a 2, -3, 2, comma, negative, or not -3, 2, 3, 2, +3. I don't like that. A 2, 3. And then this one is going to be a 1, 2, 3, 4. A 4, 3. All right. And each of these are in the same line. So they all have that same y value. Okay. So when we go to list these, when we go to list the ordered pairs, it gave us the braces here, the little curly brackets. So we're just going to type them out right in line. So our first one was -5, 3. Don't forget that comma. Then our next one was 0, 3. And then the one after that was 2, 3. And then that last one we had was 4, 3. So we've just gone through and we've listed our ordered pairs. And now since this got formatted kind of funky, I'm just going to kind of ignore the circles here. And instead, I'm just going to type in my table. So when I go to type in my table, actually, before I get to my table, let's go ahead and let's list the domain for this. All right. List the domain. The domain, once again, anytime we list something, we want to use these braces, the curly brackets, these braces, the squiggly things. And now for our domain, we're going to write the x values. We're going to write the x values, our x ordered pair, or x coordinate of our ordered pair, and we're going to write it in value of least to greatest. So our first one's going to be this -5. Then we're going to have 0, and then 2, and then 3. And we're going to close that brace. And when we go to list our range, our y, our output, we're going to write out our range, and we're going to go in value of least to greatest. These are all the same numbers. And since we don't repeat our values when we are listing them, our domain and our range, we're just going to have 1, 3. Okay. And even though we have 4 different ordered pairs, we have this 3 repeated. So we do not want to write 3 more than one time. So make sure you're careful with that. All right. And so now when we go to look at this table, when we go to fill in this table, we're going to fill in our x values right down, and then our y values right down. When we do our table, we will repeat those values. So our first x is going to be a -5, and then the next one is going to be a 0, and then our next one is going to be a 2, and we're just going to put them out in the order that they show up from left to right in the graph. We got a 2, and then we have a 3. All right, we got 5, 0, 2, 3. And when we go to write our y, once again, we aren't gonna write it the same way we write our range. We're gonna write out each value. So we're gonna have this 3 here, and then we're gonna have it here, and then we're gonna have it here, and then we're gonna have it here. All right. When we write out our table, we write the corresponding ordered pair. So we have our X ordered pairs, and then they write the Y ordered pair that goes with it. Now, when we go to do our diagram mapping, we have our inputs on the left. They'll always be on the left, our inputs. And if you think back, our inputs are our X values. And then on the right, we will have our outputs. Our outputs are our Y values. Our X values are going to be the X values we got in the thing: a 5, a 0, a 2, and a 4. And I just saw that in my table. I typed that incorrectly. That should be a 4. All right. When we are doing our diagram mapping, we don't repeat our values, okay? If we gather a value more than once, we just leave it there. So with our list, our listing, our domain, and our range, we want to make sure that we don't repeat our values. When doing our mapping, we want to make sure we don't repeat our values. But when doing our tables, it is perfectly okay for us to repeat our values, okay? And when you do your mapping, you have to draw arrows from your input to its corresponding output. So if I have an arrow going from let's use this color. I have an arrow going from 5. My ordered pair for 5 was 5, 3. So I have an arrow going to that from 5. Then I have 0 also going to 3 because that was an ordered pair. Then I have 2 going to 3 as well because that was an ordered pair. Then I have 4 going to 3 because that was also an ordered pair. So our diagram mapping has arrows. Our range, our outputs, our Y, those don't repeat. Our table has all of our values listed, and if there is, and you can have things repeating. So if you have a value multiple times, you can write that repeating. And then for our domain and our range, we don't have those repeat either. And actually, what you want to make sure you do, which I didn't do initially, you want to include what it is. So you're going to use a big D for domain and a big R, a capital R for range. So your range is 3 and your domain is this list here, okay? Let's move on to this next step and try again. So with this one, it's given us a diagram map and it's telling us to use the mapping diagram to fill in the rest of the stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and type out my labels for this. This is going to be my output, which is X. And this one on the right is going to be my input. Oop, I got that backwards. This first one is going to be my input. And then the second one on the right is going to be my output. Alrighty. And so when I go to write my table, I can just write out type out my values pretty easily. My X values are always going to be the same as what's given to me in the diagram. So we have a 0 here, a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. Oh, and a 4. And then when we go to write out our Y, you're going to look at where the arrow is pointing from the diagram map and write that as your corresponding Y. So my 0, that arrow is pointing to 0. That goes to 0 here. My 1 is pointing all the way down here to 4. So for my 1 on my table, I'm going to have a 4. My 2 is pointing up to 2. So that's going to be a 2. My 3 is pointing to my 3. So that's going to be a 3. Then my 4 is pointing to the 4. So that's going to be a 4. All right. So going from a map to a table, not too hard. That's probably the easier of the ones. And now let's go from that map to a graph. to a coordinate plane. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to label my plane. I have y up here, which is also positive. Actually, go back and I'll do that in a different color. And then I have my x, okay? Up is positive, to the right is positive, down is negative, and to the left is negative. When I go to label these, I have 0, 0. That 0, 0, that's just going to be right here at the origin. Then I have 1, 4. And actually, you can look at the table since you don't have to try to follow the arrows. That's a bit easier. 1, 4, I'm going to go to the right once, and I'm going to go up 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's going to be that one. And then I'm going to go 2, 2. So to the right twice. 1, 2. Up twice. 1, 2. That's 2, 2. And then 3, 3. To the right 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And up 3. Since these are all positive numbers, it's going to be all to the right and up. And then I have 4, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, there we go. And finally, we're going to list our domain and our range. Now, remember, when we go to list things, you have to use these braces. And also, when you list things, you're going to list them in ascending order from the least to the greatest. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 as our domain. And don't forget that you have to also write, you have to also write this capital D out in front. So let me go ahead and do that. Capital D, signify domain, and that's going to be this. And then when we go to do our range, same thing. We're going to start off with a capital R, signify range. We're going to do a brace, and then our range goes from 1 or from 0, and the next highest one is 2, then 3, and then 4. And since even though we have 4 twice, we are only going to write it once because we only list them once when we are listing our domains in range, okay? So now we're going to change gears a little bit and try and figure out and go through the process of how to figure out the domain and range when looking at a graph. So this next step, we're going to find the domain and range from a continuous graph. That just means from a graph that keeps going, from a graph usually. Okay, from a continuous graph. So for the domain, we're going to look at the graph and we're going to look from left to right. Oops. From left to right. The same way we read. You're going to look at that graph the same way you read. If the graph extends forever in both directions, then the domain is all real numbers. Another way you could do that would be the symbol. I actually go type that. All real numbers. So you can either write out or type out all real numbers or the symbol. And I'm going to try and draw it out. The symbol looks like this. Let me pick this green color. It's like that, an R with like 2 backs to it. All right. And so to find the range, we're going to go from bottom to top. If the graph extends forever in both directions, then the range is, once again, all real numbers, or the symbol that big R. This is called a bold R when you're writing, bold R. All real numbers. Now, here's a really, really important piece right here. If the arrows only point in one direction, then we're going to use an inequality. to write the domain or the range. So when we're trying to find the range, if the arrows only point in one direction, going in the y direction, then we're going to use an inequality. All right, and we'll look at what that looks like at the bottom here. So we have a couple of examples. There are 6 examples in total. I'm going to do 3, and I want you all to do the other 3. All right. So for this, it says find the domain and the range of each function. Remember, our vertical line is our y and our horizontal line is our x. So we see going from left to right across the graph, going this way across the graph from left to right, our arrows are going down, but they are going in all, they're extending across the graph. They're extending across the graph. See what it says? Look at the graph from left to right. If the graph extends forever in both directions, the domain is all real numbers. It's going to keep going to the left for forever, and it's going to keep going to the right for forever. And so this one, our domain is going to be all real numbers. We can look at our answer choices, and whatever doesn't have all real numbers, we can cross that out. So we know it's not going to be D or A. Those don't have all real numbers as possible answer choices. And now let's look at the range. We're going to look from bottom to top for our range. See, so let's look from bottom to top. So bottom to top. If the graph extends forever in both directions, the range is all real numbers. We see the graph doesn't extend forever in both directions, so it's not all real numbers. It stops, it doesn't go on, it stops at this 2 right here, okay? And so since it stops at 2, all the numbers that are covered in the range of this graph are values that are less than 2. So this means that for our y, our range, which satisfies that, the values that satisfies that are going to be values that are less than or equal to 2. And so we have our domain is all real numbers, and then our y are going to be values that are less than or equal to 2. Okay. That one had a little bit of trickiness going on with it, but we got through it. So now let's look at this second one here. Let's look at it for the domain. If the graph extends forever in both directions, going from left to right, then it's all real numbers. We see that this graph is going this way. It's going to keep going this way more and more and more and more, just really gradually. So that's covered there. And it's going to keep going that way more and more and more. It's going to keep going to the left and to the right as we keep going. And so that's going to be all real numbers for our domain. And so we can cross out A. And that's all we can cross off for that one. And now if we look at this going from bottom to top, does it cover everything? Is it going on for forever from going from bottom to top? It is. This arrow is constantly going down and the other one is constantly going up. So we have all real numbers for the range as well. So we cross out C and D, and we know it's going to be B. And finally, let's look at this last one, and then I want you all to try the last 3 on your own. And if you get confused, ask for help. Let's look at this one. Let's follow our directions again. The domain, let's look from left to right. From left to right, these arrows are constantly going to be going out to the left and out to the right. So that's going to be all real numbers for our domain. We can cross out this B and this D because those don't have all real numbers for our domain. And now let's look at the range. The range, we're going to look from bottom to top. And if it extends forever in both directions, it's going to be all real. It doesn't extend forever in both directions. I can see because it stops right here. Okay. So since we know it doesn't extend forever, we can go cross out one of those, and actually we've already crossed out everything that we can cross out. So where does this one stop? All the values that fit this one, all of our values for y are going to be greater than, you see how it's opening up, all the values that are greater than -4 satisfy. So y has to be greater than or equal to -4 to satisfy this equation. And so this one is going to be A. All right. So now that we've gone through the basics of relations and whatnot, go ahead, take some time and do the last 3 questions on this set of notes. And if you have questions, please do ask me, okay? Once you finish this, go ahead and get started on the class. All right.